there, it's Mrs. Nelson. Today's lesson is on blood pressure. It goes with day 5 on Friday, March the 27th. So we talked a little bit about the cardiac cycle on Wednesday. So hopefully you understand how the heart is contracting and relaxing. So remember, heart contractions was called systole, and the relaxation of the heart was called diastole. And basically the atria, both atria, the left and the right, squeeze first. That forces the blood from the atria into the ventricles, and then the ventricles will be the second kind of squeeze, and that squeezes or forces the blood out into the arteries. So blood pressure is the force of the blood against the walls of a blood vessel. The highest pressure occurs in the arteries. So if you remember back to day 1 when we talked about the different blood vessels, we talked about the fact that the arteries had to be really elastic. So they're really thicker walls, and they're quite elasticy. And this is to withstand that high pressure as the heart forces the blood out. So as the blood passes into those smaller vessels and the distance from the heart becomes greater, the blood pressure becomes reduced. We measure the blood pressure using 2 different kind of pressures, and they're measured and compared. So the systolic pressure is the amount of pressure that the blood exerts on the walls of the arteries when the ventricles contract. So the ventricles are the bigger chambers at the bottom of the heart. When they contract, that's when the blood pressure is the highest, as they are forcing the blood or squeezing the blood out of the heart into the arteries. So that's the systolic. Remember, systolic, Wednesday's lesson we talked about meant squeeze. Diastolic blood pressure is the amount of pressure the blood exerts on the walls when the ventricles are relaxing. So blood pressure against the arterial walls can be measured using a device called a sphygmomanometer, or more commonly referred to as a blood pressure cuff. So if you've ever been to the doctors and they put that cuff on your upper arm and they pump up that bulb, or sometimes you can get it kind of done if you, places like Shoppers Drug Mart and other pharmacies will have one that you can kind of just sit down and stick your arm in. So you don't have this kind of diagram at the bottom, this one here. It's normally something that I write on. You may want to copy it down. I would recommend it. But when we look at your blood pressure, first of all, it's measured in millimeters of mercury. That's the number. This top number, I've got written down 120, is the systolic blood pressure. So this is when the ventricles are contracting. This is when your blood pressure is the highest. The bottom number, 80 in this case, is the diastolic blood pressure. So this is the pressure when the ventricles are relaxed. This is your low number. And this is often, your doctor, if you were to get your blood pressure taken or have high blood pressure, your doctor is worried about both the numbers, but often they're worried about the bottom number. This is how much pressure is basically on your arteries all the time. And that can be a real concern if that bottom number is really, really high. The normal range, a normal reading of blood pressure is less than 130 millimeters of mercury systolic and 85 millimeters of mercury diastolic. Optimal, or kind of the best, optimal is less than 120 over 80. So a typical reading for a healthy adult is usually 120 over 80. And it's really important to know that that 120 over 80 is when you're at rest. So if you're rushing around, if you are running into the pharmacy, you picked up a few things, there's a lineup, you get upset or whatever else, you're impatient, and then you take your blood pressure. That might be higher. So you certainly want to make sure if you're taking your blood pressure that you've relaxed for quite a few minutes before you do so. The blood pressure accounts for the blood flow in the arteries and arterioles, while the skeletal muscle contractions account for the blood flow in those veins and venules. And we talked about that on day 1. So there's no tiny hearts in your toes to pump the blood back from your feet back up to your heart. So your veins and venules, the pressure is quite low in them, not as low as the capillaries, but it's low. And your skeletal muscles as you're walking will squeeze that blood back, and then the valves close to prevent backflow. Hypo, remember we talked about hypotonic. Hypo still means less. So hypo refers to lower blood pressure than usual. And hypotension can be an issue if you've got really, really low blood pressure. Sometimes you might pass out because there's not enough pressure to get the blood up to your brain. But hypertension is a lot more common. It refers to higher blood pressure than usual, because hyper again means greater. So we're going to talk a little bit after March break. This is your last lesson that I'm going to do a video for until after March break. We're going to talk a little bit about different kind of diseases of kind of the heart and cardiovascular system that week of April 6th to the 9th. But your assignment for today is you can watch the crash course video on YouTube, do the virtual lab, and then do part D on pages 21 and 22, and part G on page 23 of task 12. I'll also be putting up an exit slip before Friday that you can try before then. Links to the videos and virtual labs are in the lesson plan or the weekly plan on Teams. I hope that's helpful. And again, if you have any questions, please feel free to get a hold of me. Hope you're doing well.